we're here at Liverpool Street Station to talk about W.G.Sebald's book Austerlitz, which tells the story of a young Czech boy who leaves Prague in 1938 on a kinder transport and arrives at Liverpool Street to be welcomed by a Welsh Calvinist minister and his wife. He grows up thinking that he's Welsh and learns only later about his identity as a Czech Jew. One of the interesting things about the novel is that it's illustrated with a large number of photographs. So what we're going to do today is visit some of the locations that are depicted in those photographs. And our first port of call is the Great Eastern Hotel. Well, Austerlitz is an art historian working here in London, and he encounters the narrator in 1967 at Antwerp Station. The thing that strikes the narrator immediately at the time is a shock of blonde hair that Austerlitz has, and that the narrator has only otherwise seen on the hero of Fritz Lang's Nibelungen film. That first encounter is the first of many. They meet in Belgium over a period of months or years, but then they fall out of contact and they don't meet again for 30 years until they bump into each other, quite coincidentally here in the saloon bar of the Great Eastern Hotel. And that's the point at which Austerlitz begins to tell his story to the narrator. One of the things that Austerlitz reveals to the narrator when they first meet here is that the Great Eastern Hotel has a Masonic Temple. So we'll go in search of that Masonic Temple presently, in particular to see if we can identify the location of a particular photograph of a rather unusual three-storied ark. So the ark that we find here is one of a series of images that secretly or surreptitiously communicate to the reader, and indeed to Austerlitz himself, the nature of his true identity, namely his Jewishness. So, for example, when he's a schoolboy, he's given a Bible that has a photograph in it of a Jewish encampment outside Mount Sinai. And he talks about feeling at the time that this was the place he truly belonged. And at that point in the text, he does not know that he's Jewish, but he feels a strange and secret affiliation with this particular image. Later on, there is a photograph of a military encampment just by the pyramids, which is of course a reference to the Jews in Egypt. And throughout the earlier part of this text, we have various images of this kind that suggest Austerlitz's identity without explicitly revealing it. So the images in the book accompany the account of his tour of the hotel. He's shown round by a manager called Pereira, who seems on hand to fulfill his every wish, and indeed the narrator's every wish. And we have here photographs of a high glass dome. The picture of the glass dome is typical of most of the photographs of glass and iron architecture. It's very high contrast. It's not a professional image. It's a snapshot probably taken with a cheap camera. The photograph of the ark is likewise quite dark. It's very difficult to make out any detail on it, and this is typical of the kind of photographs that we find in this text. They're not professional images. They are culled from a variety of sources, and on the whole their documentary or pseudo-documentary value is far more important than their aesthetic qualities.
I saw the pictures of this temple in black and white when it was in 19th century, beginning of 20th century, and it looks exactly the same. The color of the chairs was green leather. That's what I was told. But I haven't seen that.
I suspect it's not here. Yeah, ornamental gold-painted picture of a three-story ark floating beneath a rainbow.
It's definitely not here.
No. I mean, it's fantastic to see it, but in a way, the point of coming here is to show that the Ark it's a game of hide and seek.
I knew that these were being incorporated into a work of fiction, and they were helping to tell the story. He came to me once with a family album of photographs. I mean, they're not his family. They're not the people who he names in his book, because that's fiction. So he's just using those images to fit in with his story. And what always puzzled me was how he went about constructing the stories, and whether he collected the photographs and then wrote the story, or wrote the story and then found the photographs. And I think it's a combination. Well, I know it's a combination of the two, because there are some times when he was looking for a particular image, and he clearly decided what he wanted to write. I think it's on there. Yes, these little square photographs, which are taken, which are the work of the photographer mentioned in the book, and these are detailed photographs taken from here. This was one of the books that I had in my collection, Picturesque Britain, and he picked this one out, and I think he probably took it away, and when he brought it back, he'd marked up with an overlay of the images he wanted, and they're all details of larger photographs. This is the one of the coast here, which he's taken the detail in here, framed it up. And if you look at that I mean, you'd have a job to know what that photograph was, or what it represented. It's more of an abstract image. And then the other one, there's another one in here, which is the tiles here, which again is focused in so closely that you just get an abstract pattern of tiles, which is on this roof. That's this one here with the tiles. Yes. I think he wrote the text with some pictures in mind, and then he looked for photographs, and then he adapted his story, or and it's a process, isn't it, of building up it's not a question of writing the book and then we'll put these illustrations in.
On another occasion, he asked me whether I had any photographs of myself at school sports days, and that I guessed that he was looking for that photograph that turns up in Austerlitz of the Star Grange rugby team, something like that. But one of the things that I suppose sticks in my mind most basically is his observation that we get more out of other people's photographs than we do out of our own, even though he is taking lots and lots of photographs himself. That sense that he wants us to approach the world that he's presenting to us through things that we don't recognise and don't have any kind of take on, so that somehow it makes us as spectators wonderfully clean sheets, as it were, and therefore responsive to lots and lots of things we might not have expected ourselves to be responsive to. And that this kind of idea that it's photographs that are searching you out, that are, as it were, the masters of destiny, and that are inquiring, every time you look at them, are inquiring into you, so that they might become the subject of sudden associations or involuntary memories. But as I say, images that one is that much more vulnerable to because one is completely unfamiliar with them.
Something that emerges only gradually in this novel is the importance of the railways. There is a secret obsession with railways whose meaning only transpires towards the middle of the text, when Austerlitz realizes that at the age of 4.5 he was placed on a Kindertransport to get him out of Nazi-occupied Prague to safety in the UK, and he arrives here in Liverpool Street Station. And the obsession, therefore, with the glass and iron architecture of station roofs points towards this revelation. Probably the key moment in the text takes place in the now demolished ladies' waiting room of Liverpool Street Station. Following a hunch, Austerlitz pursues a porter through a door that he hadn't noticed before, pushes his way through a curtain, and finds himself in a deserted waiting room. And while he's there, he experiences a strange vision where he encounters his childhood self sitting there in Liverpool Street Station, having arrived off a Kindertransport. And that is the moment at which Austerlitz begins to uncover his own history, which he has repressed for so long. We're at Liverpool Street Station, so if you actually come to Liverpool Street Station, you can see some of the key locations of the novel. Behind me, of course, the magnificent iron and glass roof, the cast iron columns. Those are the site of Austerlitz's most important revelation. The book is full of more mundane details as well, such as the McDonald's behind me, where Austerlitz and the narrator wait for a train after one of their meetings. And intriguingly, in 2006, so 5 years after the book was published, this memorial to the Kindertransports appeared. The Kindertransports, of course, playing such a central role in the life of the main character.
Well, I started at the University of East Anglia in 1966, and Max was there in the 70s, so sometime after that, and I don't know when, probably early 80s, I started doing work for him for his teaching. It's difficult to explain how meticulous Max was in getting this all right, because you've got to know where the text and the size of the image is coming, otherwise you just send to your printer the text and he puts the image sort of at the bottom of the page or the top of the page, and it splits up, it doesn't come in the right part of the text. It had to work. In general, we would have a mixture of old photographs, postcards, books, magazines, some photocopies that he'd copied, put together, reduced, all sorts of things. And there was the diary in one of these books, and there's some keys. I think there's one or two objects that I photographed as well. I had a photocopy of the whole page with the text, and he'd pasted on photocopied versions of the images exactly how he wanted, because that's important, how he fits that into the page. And so I had the original manuscript in my darkroom beside me as I was printing them up. Yeah, I mean this is an interesting one, because obviously we've got 4 different photographs, and I had to scale them up so that the eyes came down in the centre of the page there. He was very generous. He gave me copy of the book in German, which I couldn't read, but obviously I could look at the pictures. And of course the first thing that struck me was that they weren't of the highest quality in the book. So I discussed this with Max, and he was absolutely delighted with the way they turned out, and the German printers had produced them on the right paper, and they'd produced a lovely hardback edition. And we're talking about the earlier books, and I think you have to look very carefully, but in some of the sort of later publications, some of the paperback versions, they actually the photographs are crisper and less mysterious. I mean, I think it's a part of weaving this sort of web of mystery that is not only in the text, but it's very much in the photographs. Occasionally we had something that might be a little bit lighter or a bit darker or something, but I followed his instructions very carefully, and I think that was important. If you're going to crop an image, and it had to be the right. Yes.
So we are here now in the Royal Observatory at Greenwich, which is the site of the second major encounter between Austerlitz and the narrator. In the course of their visits, they go around the museums. One of the things that they clearly see is a clock. The photograph of the clock is reproduced in the text, and yet there is no information about it. We don't know whose clock it is. We don't know why it's there. We don't really know how it links in with the rest of the text. So this is the museum part of the Royal Observatory, and we're looking now at the clock that's depicted in the text, and it turns out actually that it was a clock belonging to Captain William Bligh, captain of the Bounty, on which of course a famous mutiny occurred in the 1770s. And this clearly tells us something about Sebald's use of photography. The image, as it appears in the text, is uncaptioned. It's not totally clear how it relates to what is going on elsewhere. But of course, once you do a little bit of research, it transpires that this timepiece has an extremely interesting history that is to do with colonial exploitation, to do with resistance against tyranny, but it's also to do with the curious persistence of objects as bearers of history and cultural memory that outlast human lives and persist across the centuries until they come down to us now and allow us to reanimate that past.
You take a place like Leighton Hall, which has become full of objects which relate to the life of the hall and those who live in it, down the generations, this history of objects. And you say, well, what happens to these objects then? Because these are the objects that are remembering the people who touched them and bought them and so on and so on and so on. These are the things that survive. And yet, of course, where they end up is they don't stay in the hall, they end up in the junk shop. A junk shop is the pivotal point at which something has descended from sense into a peculiar kind of randomness and freedom of movement, a freedom of the reapplication of itself. And you say, well, just a minute, so what value do they have there? And they have become these randomized objects that in some ways I think the photographs are. You know, his books are junk shops, is what I mean. That when we open them, and the photographs of the objects in them.
We've come to Tower Hamlets Cemetery from the Greenwich Observatory. Just a couple of 100 yards away is the bustle of London's East End, and yet here we're in a place of complete tranquility. It's a Victorian cemetery, the graveyards are crooked and falling over, the foliage is unkempt, and the place exudes an air of calm, gentle decay. It's a location to which Austerlitz returns frequently during the novel, and the narrator reproduces 2 photographs of the cemetery within the pages of the book. So we're now going to have a look to see if we can find the graves depicted on those photographs. In terms of the development of Austerlitz's life story, he has returned to Prague, having discovered his Czech Jewish origins. And while in Prague, he locates his childhood nanny, who is still alive. She talks him through his early childhood, and together they visit the places that they visited when he was still young and before he left Prague on the Kindertransport. Now, when he returns to London, he begins to suffer a kind of psychological breakdown, and he returns to Tower Hamlets to the cemetery here on a daily basis as a kind of therapy. The cemetery makes him feel calm, and it holds at bay the anxiety attacks that would otherwise threaten to engulf him. Okay, well, here it is, and this is the grave that's depicted in Sebald's book. The stones have moved around a little bit in the meantime, but basically they're all here. And the thing that strikes me about this is how small it is. I was expecting something monumental. You know, the text passage into which this photograph is inserted is about the colossal scale of the monuments that the Victorians built to their dead. And yet what we find here is a relatively modest grave. The figure is perhaps 3 feet high. So Tower Hamlets Cemetery is a place where Austerlitz finds calm during the day. He comes here to find repose. But we are told in the text that he experiences profound and serious anxiety attacks at night. And this leads eventually to his being admitted to St. Clement's Hospital, which, as it happens, is adjacent to this cemetery. So we're now going to see if we can find St. Clement's Hospital. So at this point in the book, Austerlitz can no longer hold at bay the mental disturbance that has been threatening to engulf him since his return to London from Prague. And after being admitted to the hospital, he is sent to a nursery in Romford where he's rehabilitated by a kind of horticultural therapy. We have a photograph in the text of St. Clement's Hospital. It's clearly part of the so-called architecture of the bourgeois age, that is Austerlitz's own interest as a professional architectural historian. It was clearly a way of disciplining certain individuals by removing them from society because of their mental illness and then subjecting them to a certain kind of disciplinary regime. Now, the interesting thing about Austerlitz is that it also incorporates a photograph of one of Austerlitz's companions at the Romford nursery, and it is impossible to say what his ailment is. So it's almost a kind of anti-disciplinary photograph. So Austerlitz is himself a photographer. He develops a passion for photography while a schoolboy. It ties in clearly with his interest in architecture, and the first time that the narrator sees him, he's taking photographs of the central station in Antwerp. Many of these photographs are reproduced in the novel, but perhaps more importantly, they are, as it were, bequeathed to the narrator. So Austerlitz not only tells his story to the narrator, but he gives the narrator the visual material that is then reproduced in the pages of this book.
But I had an office and then a dark room, and they were connected with a light trap, so there was no door. You didn't have to knock, you could come wandering in. So if I was busy in the dark room, I would just hear a voice and say, come in, and he would come into the dark room. But certainly at one occasion, when he was looking for photographs that were meant to be taken by this photographer and wanted to know the process, he came and stood beside me and saw how it was being done. I mean, I don't think that's his only experience of photography, but it helped him to sort of build up that picture. That's one of his original photographs, I definitely remember that. And it was taken with a flash, and because it's a very long tunnel going right down here, the flash just didn't penetrate. But I don't think, having read the text and I don't think Max was disappointed. I think that was how he wanted it. You've still got the lights, electric light bulbs there. I look at that today and I think, well, that's not a very good photograph. But in this work, it sort of doesn't feel out of place. This is one of my photographs, and it's actually an office in the Sainsbury Centre in Norwich where I worked. He would have known this office and walked past it and thought, oh, I'll ask Michael to photograph it. And he is talking about an art historian in this part of the book. I produced the photographs for Max, but there are very few actual original works by me, and that's one of them.
The visit to Prague then sparks in Austerlitz a desire to find some evidence of his mother's existence. He becomes obsessed actually with tracking down her image, but as good fortune would have it, he does discover an image of a woman in the Prague Theatre archives who the nanny confirms is in fact his mother. And in a sense that is the culmination point of the text, the quest of this text, once Austerlitz has become aware of his real identity, is to find his mother. Once he's done so, he goes off in search of his father. So we're here at Austerlitz's house, which is the first in the row behind me. The reason we know it's Austerlitz's house is because it's described in the book as being next to a 50-metre long wall. The narrator visits Austerlitz here on several occasions, staying in a sparsely furnished guest room. The whole house is Spartan. The furniture is wood, there is very little comfort. And one of the curious things that we learn is that Austerlitz is in the habit of laying out photographs as though playing a game of patience, and then moving them around in a more or less random fashion in order to identify family resemblances between them. And it may well be that there is an echo of this technique in the pages of Austerlitz itself, where certain of the images, for example of the glass and iron architecture, seem to cross-refer across hundreds of pages and communicate this sense of family resemblance to us. So the other reason we're here is to track down the location that features in the last but one photograph of this text. And that's a photograph of the Jewish cemetery that lies adjacent to Austerlitz's house. It's just here. So behind this, well, what is described in the book as a man's high wall, is significantly larger wall in fact, lies an Ashkenazi cemetery. But its existence in the text is a kind of metaphor for Austerlitz's own relationship to his Jewish identity. He discovers his Jewish identity belatedly, and similarly he lives for the entirety of his adult life in the house we've just seen, not realizing that just next door is a cemetery that embodies the very distinguished history of the Jews in London. Now, unfortunately, we can't gain entrance to the cemetery here, but the interesting thing is that that graveyard image forms an interesting pair with the last photograph of the text. The last photo is allegedly the view from a hotel room. We don't take this image at face value. We see in it not just a banal view from a hotel window, but echoes of the Holocaust, the barbed wire, the chimneys of the crematoria. And so these last two images sum up the vibrant and deep-rooted history of the Jews in Europe, as well as their annihilation by the Nazis.
The whole business of photography itself is an essentially enumerative way of speaking about things, that one can just juxtapose one image, another image, another image, another image, where in fact the whole thrust of the kind of writing that he's doing is actually tracing paths. Either they're paths across countryside or they're paths backwards. And so that there are, again, two principles which are apparently are pushing against each other, which is a sort of search for truth on the one hand, and the idea of being prepared to let things unravel without a syntax, as it were, just juxtaposed. On the other, his prose is moving towards an unending stream, that in Austerlitz there are no paragraphs. That is to say that, as it were, the way that writing might create a sequence, single out events, is becoming somehow less important. And that you think, yes, but this stream then is a voice, isn't it? That's kind of... And of course, the strange thing about his work is that he's always listening to someone else. The distinction that I've always wanted to make is between a labyrinth which has one path that takes you to the centre. You find what you want, or you kill the Minotaur, and then the difficulty is just to find your way back out again. Against that is the multicursal labyrinth, which is many paths which actually don't take you anywhere at all, that you just get onto another path and you carry on and there is no objective. There is still the question of whether you can get out, but you're not carrying a treasure when you do get out. It's just something that has come more or less to a halt. Well, is Austerlitz like that too? That, that he hasn't found his father, that the journey doesn't end with some kind of resolution.